Okay, so I would usually pay about $3 for a full meal in China. Not street food, not snacks, just a normal everyday local restaurant meal. But that's not even the surprising part. So in a lot of places in China, a basic meal at a local restaurant is usually around $2 to $5. And this isn't a special deal or a discount. This is just everyday life. People eat out like this constantly. It's just how people live. It's the same whether it's breakfast, lunch, or dinner. You'll see small local restaurants everywhere you go. So basic food in China can feel extremely cheap compared to the United States. But that only tells part of the story. And it's not just eating out. You can also just buy groceries and cook at home. Local markets are everywhere, and basic things like vegetables, rice, and meat are usually very affordable. You don't really think twice about buying day-to-day essentials. But once you start looking at imported foods or Western brands, the prices jump pretty quickly. So even with food, it really depends on what you're buying. But this goes beyond food. It shows up in the cost of living, especially in transportation. So getting around in China is where the difference in cost of living becomes really obvious. Metros are fast, clean, and extremely cheap. In most cities, a ride across town is usually about $1 or even less. Taxis and ride-hailing apps are also much more affordable than in the United States. And in a lot of places in China, you don't really need a car at all. And that changes everything because when you don't need a car, one of your biggest monthly expenses that you would have paid in the United States just disappears. But housing is where it starts to get more complicated. In my case, my rent was actually covered by the school I work for, which is pretty common for foreign teachers. But outside of that, rent in China really depends on where you are and how you live. In bigger cities, especially places like Shanghai, prices can vary dramatically depending on the district and the type of apartment. In smaller cities, rent is usually much cheaper in general. So even something as fixed as rent isn't really fixed at all. And when you start looking at everything together, that's where things really start to get interesting. So food, groceries, transport, and housing, they're all priced very differently. And at first, it really feels like there's no logic to it. Some things are extremely cheap in one situation and completely normal in another. But the more you actually live in China, the more you realize it's not random at all. It's just that different parts of life are being priced in completely different ways. And once you notice that, it's hard to ignore. And when you look at all this together, something starts to stand out. Because now it's not really about individual prices anymore, it's about how those prices fit together. And when you start seeing it that way, you realize you're not looking at one cost of living. You're looking at different versions of it, depending on how you live. So the question isn't just whether China is cheap, it's what kind of China you're actually experiencing. And those are not the same thing. And that difference is actually the key to understanding all of this. Because what you're really seeing isn't just random pricing differences, it's two different systems operating at the same time. One is a local economy, the other is the lifestyle economy you bring with you. In a local economy, daily life is built around local food, local transport, and local spending habits. And in that system, things can feel extremely affordable. But in a lifestyle economy, you start importing expectations from the West with imported food, Western brands, familiar habits, and international services. And suddenly, the same city feels much more expensive. That's why two people can live in the same exact place and have completely different experiences of China. And once you understand that, the next question becomes who is actually experiencing China as cheap? So a lot of this comes down to income and perspective. If you're earning in dollars or euros and spending in yuan, the math feels immediately different. A $5 meal feels almost insignificant. A couple of dollars for transport doesn't really register. Even small daily expenses start to blur together. You stop thinking about every individual purchase in the same way. But if you're earning a local salary, the same prices hit differently. We're talking about incomes that can be around $1,000 a month or less in many cases. So those small daily costs actually matter in a very real way. It changes how people make everyday decisions. What feels casual for one person can feel like a real expense for another. And that difference shapes how people experience the same city completely differently. So cheap isn't a fixed label. It depends entirely on what you're comparing it to. And that's also where things start to change. Because this is also where reality starts to break people's expectations. China can feel extremely cheap in one context and surprisingly expensive in another. For example, a cappuccino at Starbucks in Shanghai costs about the same as it does in New York City. But right next door, you can walk into a small local shop and get a bowl of noodles for around $2. The same street with completely different pricing systems. And you can switch between them by just walking a few steps. That contrast is everywhere once you start noticing it. It's not that one version is true and the other isn't. They're both happening at the same time. That's because a lot of Western brands price globally, while local businesses price based on the local economy. So, depending on what you choose, you can end up in completely different cost structures. And that's where people often get confused because they're seeing both realities at the same time. So, the more you live like you did back home, the more expensive China starts to feel. And that same split shows up in housing too. So, housing works in a similar way, but it's even more complex. In a city like Shanghai, you can find apartments that cost as much as major cities in the United States, especially in central districts. Sometimes even more if you're looking at newer buildings or prime locations. But that's only one part of the market. Move an hour outside the city center, and prices drop dramatically. And the further you go from those core districts, the more that difference becomes obvious. You start seeing entire neighborhoods where the cost structure is completely different, not just slightly cheaper, fundamentally different. And in smaller cities, rent can be a fraction of what you'd expect in a Western city. But the trade off is that everything is structured around that local scale of living. So what counts as expensive or cheap changes depending on the context you're in. And that's why simple comparisons between countries don't really work here, because you're not comparing one housing market to another. You're comparing multiple levels inside the same system. And once you start thinking in those terms, the bigger pattern becomes even clearer. So at this point, it really comes down to how you choose to live in China, because you can live very locally, or you can try to recreate your life from back home as much as possible. If you live locally, your costs tend to stay on the lower end. You're eating local food, using local transport, and following local habits. And even your daily routines start to adjust without you really thinking about it. Over time, it just becomes normal. But if you try to import your lifestyle with Western food, familiar brands, and international routines, your costs start to rise quickly, not because the country changes, but because your expectations do, and because you're choosing a different way of living inside the same place. And that's the part most people miss. Where you are matters less than how you live inside it. And when you look at everything together, one final thing becomes clear. So that $3 meal I mentioned at the beginning, it wasn't cheap because China is cheap. It was cheap because I was living like someone who actually lives there. Then when I started recreating my old lifestyle with imported food, Western habits, and familiar comforts, the prices changed. Same country, same city, different experience. China isn't simply cheap or expensive. It depends on the version you're living inside. And that version is shaped by your choices more than anything else. So when people ask if China is cheap, the better question is what kind of life they're comparing it to. Because what I experienced went far beyond prices. It was a completely different way of moving through everyday life. So prices tell you what things cost. Context tells you what they mean. And thank you so much everybody for watching this video. If you like this video, please consider subscribing to my channel. I have many more videos coming just like this one. And also maybe let me know in the comments, do you think anything is really cheap or expensive? Or is it just how we choose to live? And thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see everyone for the next time.